So welcome, everybody. Special welcome to Richard for this evening of exchange of thoughts. We more or less will be doing it the same way we did the first time. So I will be sharing some slides with you on a PowerPoint presentation, a little bit on the background of the text that we are more or less focusing on. Was ist das die Philosophie in German, or what is that philosophy? And then Richard will say a few things, and basically we can ask each other some questions, or we start immediately with a discussion with all who are here. Since Jude cannot stay up too long, it's already 2 o'clock for him. So anyway, let's put up a slide. Yes, Louise, I will. Here's one. Or we can do it from the beginning. If it works, it works. So the famous Plato Aristotle painting that most people have seen before, since we're talking about Greek philosophy in the main. So on the background of this little text, in August 1955, Heidegger traveled to France with his friend Jean Beaufret. Of course, Jean Beaufret is a French philosopher who came to visit Heidegger shortly after the end of the Second World War, and Heidegger wrote to him the famous letter on humanism. It was a reply to a letter that Beaufret had sent to Heidegger. And Beaufret was the main man basically in all things Heidegger in France until he died. In Paris, Heidegger met Jacques Lacan. It was the first time for Heidegger that he was in France, by the way. And in Varennes in Normandy, he visited also Georges Braque. The reason for the trip was a colloquium led by Beaufret, which took place from August 27th to September 3rd in Cerisy-la-Salle, under the title Qu'est-ce que la philosophie? What is philosophy? Autour de Martin Heidegger, colloque dirigé par Jean Beaufret. And among the people who were taking part was, among others, Paul Ricoeur, who you may have heard of, Gabriel Marcel, and Lucien Goldman as well. So these decades, as they were called in Cerisy-la-Salle, were mostly held as colloquia in the areas of philosophy, poetry, fine arts, and music, under the leadership of renowned experts who would invite famous directors of movies or conductors, etc. Were intended to contribute to understanding between France and Germany after the Second World War. So it was also not to fall back into the mistake after the end of the First World War, where France and Germany became more and more enemies, basically. There were a lot of attempts now to bring France and Germany together again. On August 28, 1955, Heidegger gave the opening lecture, What is Philosophy?, in preparation for the philosophical discussions and seminars that would be happening in the days after. He also chaired 3 seminar sessions on Kant, Hegel, and Hölderlin. The minutes of the discussions in Cerisy-la-Salle will appear in volume 91 of Heidegger, complete edition. In the meantime, they have been published there. So if you want to have a closer look in volume 91, you can see more on the background. Then the text, What is Philosophy, was first published in 1956 by Kundeneske in Voulinger. A year later, the text appeared in the French translation by Costas Axelos and Jean Beaufret, Martin Heidegger, Qu'est-ce que la philosophie, published by Gallimard, who published most of Heidegger's work in France, in Paris. In 1964, Heidegger wrote another text on philosophy, The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking. It was read in French, in the French translation by Jean Beaufret at the colloquium Heidegger Vivant, that was organized by UNESCO in Paris from 21st till 23rd of April 1964. Heidegger published it in German in his 1969 volume Zusage des Denkens. And most famous German, French philosophers were attending this colloquium. Karl Jaspers was there, for example. So now we get to the text and have some quotes from the text. The word philosophia tells us that philosophy is something which, first of all, which is first of all probably too big. Move you a bit to the side. Determinative of the existence of the Greeks, but not only that. Philosophia also determines the innermost basic feature of Occidental European history. Of course, the famous German word Abendland, which is often translated as Occidental European. Therefore, if we want to find an answer to the question, what is that philosophy? We must involve ourselves in a conversation with Greek philosophy. So Heidegger philosophy started in Greece and is mainly a Greek way of thinking that determines the history of thinking in the Western world afterwards, through the Middle Ages up to Heidegger, basically. And then a bit later he says, but not only what is in question, philosophy is Greek in origin, but also the way in which we question. The way in which we still question today is Greek. This is his famous question, what is that? In Greek, we hear this as ti estin. The question of what something is, however, remains ambiguous. We can ask, what is that over there in the distance? Receive the answer, a tree. The answer consists in giving a name to something that we do not recognize exactly. So naming is an important part of thinking. And of course, that's one of the things that the poets are supposed to do. The Greek word philosophia, now in Greek letters, goes back to the word philosophos. This word is originally an adjective like phila, kyros, silver-loving, like philotimos, honor-loving. The word philosophos was probably coined by Heraclitus. This means for Heraclitus there's not yet the philosophia. Aner philosophos is not a philosophical person. The Aner philosophos loves the Sophon. According to Sophon says this, hen panta, one is everything. Everything here means pantata, onta, the whole, the all of beings. And the one means the one, the only one, the unifying of everything. But all beings in being are united. The Sophon says all beings are in being. Hey, you want to say something, Richard? You see this little thumb, or is that not intentional? To put it more precisely, says Heidegger, being is the being. Here is transitive and means as much as in gathered. Being gathers beings in that it is beings. Being is the gathering, the logos. And yet, it was precisely this, that beings remain gathered in being, that beings appear in the appearance of being, that astonished the Greeks. And they first and only. Beings in their being, this was for the Greeks the most amazing thing. So not everything as this is as a tree and as a dog or a cat or a human being or beauty, but the being of it is what made them wonder and astonish them. The answer to the question, what is philosophy, consists in our corresponding to what philosophy is heading towards. Because if it's philosophos, it's heading towards the Sophon. And the Sophon is the being of beings. In such a corresponding, we listen from the beginning to what philosophy has already given us. Philosophy, that is the Greek understood philosophia. Therefore, we can only reach the correspondence, Entsprechung in German. That is the answer to our question, by remaining in conversation with that to which the tradition of philosophy delivers us, frees us. We find the answer to the question what philosophy is, not through historical statements about the definitions of philosophy, but through the conversation with what has been handed down to us as the being of beings. Of course, the being of beings is understood differently in the history of metaphysics. Aristotle's understanding of the being of beings is different from Kant's, for example. And of course, here as well, for Heidegger, it's not talking about philosophy as some kind of object, but it's always trying to get people to philosophize, so to start thinking for themselves. As long as you don't think, you will never know what philosophy is, to put it simple. Now, one could rightly demand, to continue, that our conversation be limited to the question of philosophy. This limitation would only be possible and even necessary if it were to emerge in the conversation that philosophy is not what it is now interpreted as, a correspondence that brings the affirmation of the being of beings into expression. In other words, our conversation does not set itself the task of carrying out a fixed program. But I would like to endeavor to prepare all those who take part in it for a gathering in which we are addressed by what we call the being of beings. By naming this, we think of what Aristotle already says, being appears in many different ways. Tauon, leketai, polagos. It's of course also the starting point of Brentano's famous dissertation on the manifold meanings in Aristotle. So now making a little jump. 9 years later, in this other lecture on philosophy, the end of philosophy and the task of thinking, Heidegger is asking the following: would the title of the task of thinking then be, instead of being and time, clearing and presence, Dichtung und Anwesen? Where does the clearing come from and how? What speaks in the it? The task of thinking would then be a surrender of previous thinking to the determination of the matter of thinking, die Sache des Denkens. My question for today is, why did Heidegger give up philosophy understood as metaphysics and search for a new determination of the matter of thinking, the Sache des Denkens? So that's all to get on my part to get us started. I will discuss it more profoundly and longer.
Good.
Yes, Richard.
Okay. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk with all of you, first of all, and thanks to Alfred for organizing this. We didn't have a chance to compare notes on exactly what we were going to talk about today, so I'm glad that Alfred gave an overall summary, and I'd like to come back to that. And please forgive, I don't know why these little emojis keep popping up in my box. I'm not touching anything. So if a hand is raised or something like that, just ignore that. In any case, just to add to what Alfred said, there was an English translation of this text in 1956. The translation was by Gene Wilde and William Klubach. And it's a volume that's almost impossible to find. I had bought this many, many, many years ago. And the translation is pretty good. The German is on the facing side, it's on the left side, and the English is on the right-hand side, so you could compare very nicely. I doubt that you could come across this book. Probably in a library, you might be able to find it if you're reading in English. And this particular lecture I've always loved. And I have, in my first book, Engaging Heidegger, a whole section on this particular lecture because I think it's rich and I think it's accessible. Unlike some of Heidegger's other talks and lectures in this period and into the 60s, this is pretty accessible, I think, and it's readable. I think it's a very interesting and rich text. Well, in the time that I have, there's just so many things to talk about, but I wanted to maybe drill down a little bit on what Alfred quoted or cited in his presentation. And that has to do with Heidegger when he begins to talk about philosophy. And he says, as Alfred had pointed out, that philosophos is for Heraclitus, as he puts it here, for Heraclitus and for Parmenides, philosophos expresses something very different from the philosophical. Now, again, what Heidegger means by that is that philosophos means hos phile to sophon, to love the wise, to love wisdom. And this, he says, for Heraclitus, though, means being in concordance or being in correspondence, Entsprechung, being in harmony with being understood by Heraclitus as the hen panta. So all things gathered together by being, all things unfolded by being, all things in being. And to be in harmony with that, with what is effectively the ontological difference, right? The famous ontological difference between being and beings. To be in harmony with that, to speak in harmony with that, henpanta, one is all, beings unfolded in being. To be in correspondence with being as it unfolds being is what Heraclitus and Parmenides and Anaximander, what we would call the pre-Socratics, understood by the philosophos, so the lover of wisdom. So he privileges Heraclitus and Parmenides in this period of Greek thinking as a primordial condition, an original condition of human beings, or at least of the thinkers of this period, of Heraclitus and Parmenides and Anaximander. It's an original primordial condition of dwelling in correspondence with the being of beings. But then he says, all right, something happened. And I'm just following along in the text in that section. He says something happened. Somehow, the Greeks began to fall away from that harmony. The Greeks began to fall away from that correspondence, that original correspondence. And he says, well, maybe it's the sophists, because they started talking about language and thinking and the aims of thinking in a different way. Well, who had to come in? Who had to come in and rescue philosophy from the sophists? And he says, well, that's Plato and Aristotle. So for Plato and Aristotle, they are too after the wise. They too are after to sophon, wisdom. But now it's different, he says. Because the Greeks had already fallen away from that original concordance or that original harmony, that original correspondence, things had changed. And now for Plato and Aristotle, philosophy means something different. Philia means something different, he says. Love for Plato and Aristotle now means a striving. It's no longer the original dwelling in the midst of beings as unfolded by being. Now there's a striving that is necessary, a striving, a human desire, eros, has now entered into the human situation, into the thinking situation. And now philosophy is, as Plato and Aristotle understand it, to be a striving after wisdom, because there is that gap, there is that separation. Something's happened, so that now thinkers must strive after wisdom. But what's the form that this striving takes? So Heidegger suggests here the striving takes the form of dialectic, rational argumentation, logic. But this is not the original correspondence of Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Anaximander. This is a different kind of correspondence. This is a striving after. This is a mediated effort to arrive again back to wisdom. But the problem, right, for Heidegger at least, the problem with dialectic, with rational argumentation, and of course with logic, is that this mediation can become an end in itself, and we lose sight of the wise and become preoccupied and fixated on the rational argument itself, on logic, on the analysis of language, and so forth. So Plato and Aristotle represent a devolution in Greek thinking, but they are still after the wise. They are still after wisdom. And in the mood, in the attunement of astonishment. So he has praise. He has high esteem for Plato and Aristotle, but it nonetheless represents this devolution. Now, what's interesting here is that Heidegger is telling a philosophical myth here. This is a story, right? This is a story of human beings originally, primordially being at one with being. And then there's a falling away. Now, you could say that this is Heidegger's Hellenized version of the Christian story of the fall of human beings. There is a fall here in Heidegger's telling. It is a falling away from an original condition represented by Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Anaximander. So it's fascinating. And I've said this before when we had this discussion about grace and Trockle and so forth, but it is quite fascinating to think about what Heidegger is doing here. He's telling a myth. He's telling a philosophical myth. And by the way, this myth or this story of human beings falling away from some kind of original primordial condition of dwelling, of harmonious dwelling, is not just a Christian story. It's a story that can be found in all the spiritual and religious traditions around the world from the beginning of time or from the beginning of human history. So I think what I'd like to think about a little bit here is what was Heidegger's aim here? I mean, we have to speculate, I suppose. I think we have to assume, maybe we don't have to assume, but let's assume that Heidegger did know that he was writing a Hellenized version of the Christian story of the fall, or of this universal, transhistorical account of human beings falling away from some original unity or from some original wholeness. I mean, let's assume he did understand that, of course, and understood that that's what he was doing. To what end? Again, we can speculate, but my sense is that, to follow up on what Alfred was saying, I think what he's trying to say here, since he is writing a myth, is that one of the ways for us to restore or attempt to restore our relation to being is by telling myths, is by poetry and storytelling. In other words, in the beginning, he seems to be saying there is no difference between mythos and logos. That sharp difference was introduced in the period of Plato and Aristotle, and then in the subsequent history of Western philosophy, where we must be concerned in philosophy only with logos, not with mythos. Mythos is something that we can discard or that we outgrow or that we progress beyond. So I think in one way we could see Heidegger perhaps enacting his own point here, that what he wishes is for an end of philosophy understood exclusively in terms of dialectic rational argument logic, and for a restoration of a fuller and richer relationship with being that requires of us that we allow different forms of expression, or that we help to allow to flourish poetic forms of thinking, mythological forms of thinking. Now, of course, I mean, this is the Heidegger that even many Heideggerians don't want to talk about, right? There are many contemporary Heideggerians who wish to plug Heidegger back into a very narrow understanding of philosophy or a very narrow understanding of phenomenology. And we've talked about that before. But by no means is what I've just talked about here phenomenological in the classical Husserlian sense, and it's not philosophical in the traditional philosophical sense. And that's his point, because he is asking us, perhaps by example, to learn from myth, fairy tales, poetry, storytelling. But what do we have to learn? What we have to learn is to restore a proper relation to being, to restore a richer way of dwelling. And that's why I think he always leaves it open-ended, right? That this is the task now. He's not going to give, as Alfred said, a fixed program for how to do that, but it has to involve poetry, it has to involve literature, it has to involve storytelling, mythology, all of these other forms of expression that have been excluded by philosophy understood in the narrow sense of the term. Okay, well, I could leave it there, and then we could talk further about these things. But this is what right now strikes me as so engaging about this lecture as I reread it in preparation for today's discussion.
Well, thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
And of course, Plato still uses myth in his philosophy, the myth of the cave and other texts. And Aristotle, we don't know for sure because we only have his theoretical work, put it that way, the notes for his lectures, and we don't have his dialogues. Because Plato is
Yes.
the other way around. So maybe Aristotle was also still using myth to get his point across. That's also
Well,
interesting.
indeed. I know, and I think he's closer to Plato than sometimes he is willing to admit.
Yeah. And later, mythology comes back in Schelling, for example, who does a philosophy of mythology. I think the Christian element also plays a role in this, focusing on the logos, which was with God at the beginning. So, and anyway, anybody has a question, remark, comment?
Yeah, I like how you put that, Richard. That falling away from the original condition, that's really interesting. You know, Luther had the light of nature, the light of grace, and the light of hope, the three lights of God. And you see that, is he re-looking at this through grace, the light of grace in a way, which I find very interesting. And I also like how you brought out the dialectical to rational forms, because it makes me think when we do modal logic of all these different philosophers, you know, where we're operating with that. And I also like, as Alfred brought out with Schelling, it is so true at the end of Schelling's life, where he does those final writings, bringing out the logos and back to more of a Christian understanding. But I like that falling away from the original condition, and where is there perhaps a light of grace that's going through Heidegger, that he's relooking at this stuff through attempt of a light of grace?
Well, Ricky, it's first of all, it's nice to talk with you. I think this is the first time we've had a chance to exchange other than in writing. So it's a pleasure to hear from you. You know, I've said this many times before, and that is, I'm not suggesting that Heidegger was a Christian thinker, but there's no doubt that he was profoundly influenced by um, the Christian kerygma and its basic stories and even liturgical forms, and I think that seems to be very evident. And I think that this story that he's telling here is remarkable in that it is a mythos. I mean, there is no way for us to know whether Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Anaximander were actually in harmony with the being of beings. I mean, it's a marvelous story that Heidegger is telling. But, and we know that he had his quarrels with Christianity, and this is not in Christian terms. It's a Hellenized version, right? I mean, it's the story of the fall transposed into Greek terms. And that's what makes it so interesting. And this is typical Heidegger, right? Because we find some of these Christian or these religious motifs disguised very often as Hellenized stories, right? Stories from the Greek period. Or they reappear in his elucidations of the poets, whether it's Hölderlin or Procol or others. So to answer your question, Ricky, I think that we can see the isomorphism here. We can see the parallel. And I think for Heidegger, the most important thing is to point us in the direction of a restoration of our relation to being, that of course in the contemporary world has been complete, in his view, in the contemporary world, it has been completely obstructed and blocked by technology and by the noise of the world. We are about as far away from that harmonious relation with being than we have ever been. And so there's a kind of a hope here that Heidegger has, right? That we can find our way back. Thank you. Thank you, Ricky.
Anybody else has a?
Well, I'll interject if no one else has anything. But hello, Richard. It's great
Hi,
to
Walter.
it's great to hear you again. And that first of all, compliments. I think that was it was profound in its clarity, and I think it really got to the core, really the core point of Heidegger's contribution. And I was thinking, when you were saying that, I had a conversation just yesterday with a friend of mine who's a brilliant in classics literature and just finished MS in philosophy, and completely metaphysical. And I remember, I told her that I made the point that teaching people metaphysics was not teaching them to think. And that kind of floored her like that. She said, I don't know how to digest that because that's what we're doing. We're teaching people metaphysics. That's thinking. And I said, no, I don't think it's thinking. It's giving people knowledge, because I had all this Heideggerian influence. But my point that I guess I was kind of trying to move to was what really struck me about your talk was I've been on sort of a journey since I went to Rome last March, and I'd been to Rome many years ago, but I walked into the Pantheon, and I think again it was the Heidegger influence. But I had this moment that struck me as soon as I walked in the door and looked up, and that was this seeing visually the collision between the church and Christianity and the Greco-Roman world. It's right there. When you look, you see the structure of the Greco-Roman world and you see the church. And it was almost like a collision to say that who we are today, we oftentimes look back at our Christian roots. But perhaps we've completely forgotten to go back and look at the Greco-Roman roots. And I think most of us go back and say, well, we get that civil law, Roman law, all that kind of thing. And no, we haven't, because we study Aristotle and Plato. But it got me thinking, because of Heidegger, we've forgotten the real Greco-Roman roots, the real Hellenistic roots, which is what I think you were talking about, that the real roots of thinking about our relationship with being. And to me, it's an incredible service that Heidegger's doing for all of us, and even the Christian world. Because I don't know about you, but I have to include Christians in the group of people that have forgotten about all that. The church thinkers and things like that. So I just wanted to mention that. I thought it just dovetailed profoundly into my experience. And to me, my journey has been one of trying to journey and revisit and bring forward that Greco-Roman influence. If we're ever going to make it as a society, we're forgetting that we need to bring that back. And that was a beautiful description you gave of getting all the way back to the original purpose of the people who first brought us philosophy, which was thinking, the pre-Socratics thinking about being and our relationship with being. So I guess it's a long way of saying it really dovetailed beautifully into kind of what my journey's been the last year.
That's terrific, Walter, and I think you're right. Now, I might simply add that we could ask whether Heidegger is entirely fair to the metaphysical tradition. I mean, he says here, and he says in other places, right, that Plato and Aristotle represent, as I said, a devolution of thinking, but nonetheless within the context of astonishment, right? I talk more about that in that chapter in Engaging Heidegger on From Angst to Astonishment. So it's still within the context of wonder. And I think we might be able to say the same thing about other thinkers. Jude and I have talked about Thomas Aquinas quite a bit, and clearly Heidegger did not feel that Thomas maintained that same context of astonishment or wonder before the being of beings in his philosophy, at least in the philosophical work, in his commentaries on Aristotle. So it represents a further devolution. But I think we could, reopen that question and ask if that's exactly the case. There is no question that Heidegger had a quarrel with what Christian thinkers did with the Greek inheritance. I think he certainly had a quarrel with that. And yet, as we see here, many of those Christian stories or themes or motifs are there still in his work, but they're disguised, or they're transformed, or they're transfigured into a Hellenized story, a story about the Greeks, a story about Greek thinking, a story about philosophical thinking. So that's a long way of saying thank you, Walter, because I think that's a very crucial issue to keep thinking about, the contributions of these two traditions.
Isn't this then, I'm interpreting, I guess, what you're saying here, but isn't this then basically he's siding with the mystics against the church proper?
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. Yeah, and I think that, right, I mean, this is why Heidegger so fiercely turns against Christianity, precisely because he was so put off by the scholasticism of his upbringing. I mean, the deadening, stultifying, claustrophobic kind of textbook Thomistic scholasticism that he grew up with, and as that was represented by the church itself, I mean, that had to become something of an enemy for Heidegger to attack. But clearly there is the spiritual impulse, the religious impulse remains there in Heidegger's thinking. I think there's no question about that, Michael. Yeah.
Yeah, Richard, my friend has a book coming out, Volker Leppen, but it's on Lutheran mysticism. And he digs into these mystical traditions like St. Bernard, and Toller and all them. And those were really deep and really rich. And I don't think a lot of people have really done a lot of scholarly work on that to see the importance of that kind of thinking.
Well, I think that's fair enough. I mean, and that's precisely what I've been trying to do for the last, at least 10 years in trying to bring to light this kind of, the difficulty is that what we're talking about here is so out of tune with contemporary academics. It's so out of sync with contemporary intellectual circles that it becomes difficult for us to share this in a larger manner, in a way that we could be heard, or we could get a fair audience for this. But nonetheless, I think we must continue to work along this way and think along this way. And I think Heidegger is a very good guide here with limitations, no doubt, with blind spots, no doubt. But nonetheless, a lecture like this is rich material for us to consider the situation we find ourselves in today and what it was that he was seeking or aiming. Especially to me, this is the core thrust and trajectory of the later Heidegger, not the early Heidegger. This is the core thrust of his thinking: to mend our relation to being, to heal the contemporary situation, to restore a richer, more harmonious relation with being. This seems to be the core aim of his thinking. And again, he has no fixed program for that, apart from saying, well, this is a possibility for us. How do we accomplish this possibility? How do we restore something richer and more meaningful for us in the contemporary age moving forward?
Well, Richard, if I could throw in an attempt to maybe bring greater cohesion between the Christian thought and Heidegger's thought from what we've been talking about. I think there may be an avenue to do that, since scholasticism and Aquinas seem to be the lightning rod for Heidegger. That seems to be the point. And one thing is, I think it doesn't perhaps come up enough that Aquinas was a mystic himself. I mean, he had significant. You read the things that are not the philosophical, the hymns he wrote. These things are deeply mystical, and I think, and I'm just doing a little defense of Aquinas here. It could be an ignorant defense because I'm not an expert in Aquinas.
Jude is on your side.
Yeah, Jude will be. But I'm thinking that there was a deeply mystical side to him. My understanding, and Jude can correct me, you can correct me, was that the whole issue of the scholastic Aristotelian movement for him was an attempt to answer the question to the medieval world who was discovering Aristotle and this neat thing called a syllogism, that everybody was running around syllogizing everything, that were there conflicts between the Christian faith and reason and logic? And my understanding was Aquinas took that on not to say, oh, here's the path to holiness, read my syllogisms. It was really more to say, let me assure you there's not a conflict between reason and faith, and we end up with the Summa. And I have to admit, the Summa, the only value I've gotten out of the Summa was having it on my bookshelf where people could see it when I went on a video, because it makes me look. I'm not there now, but it makes me look smart when you have that whole volume of Summas behind you. But I couldn't read it very far because of the same reason of Heidegger. It's just this dull syllogism after syllogism of rationality. And now I'll finalize my point by saying, I think what we did was we took that. It was our fault, whoever our are, that we have taken that piece of Aquinas and turned it into our philosophy. I think we are guilty of forgetting the mystical side of Aquinas. I don't know that I blame Aquinas as much because he had a good intention of trying to do something good, but I think we grabbed that. And again, maybe that's uninformed or ignorant, but I think there's a way to bring the two together if we realize that the man who was the lightning rod, the so-called, point of departure here of scholasticism and Aquinas, that there's more to him than what we think, and perhaps we narrowly took what he had. So that's just a suggestion.
I think it's a good suggestion, Walter, and I'd like to hear too what Jude you think about this. But let me just give you an example of why Heidegger had, though, some misgivings about Thomas. In engaging Heidegger, I pull out a very interesting passage from Aquinas's commentary on the Metaphysics of Aristotle, because in the Metaphysics of Aristotle, of course, Aristotle talks about wonder. And in the lecture we just talked about here, Heidegger says, yes, Aristotle was talking about wonder, amazement, das Erstaunen, astonishment. But it's somewhat different from the original form of astonishment that we found in Heraclitus and Parmenides and Anaximander. And so listen to what Aquinas says here, though, about wonder in his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics. This is Aquinas speaking. He says, therefore, since philosophical investigation began with wonder, admiratione is the Latin, it must end in or arrive at the contrary of this. Because when men have already learned the causes of these things, they do not wonder any longer. Hence, the goal of metaphysics to which we should advance will be that in knowing the causes of things, we do not any longer wonder about their effects.
Ouch.
Yes, ouch. Because unfortunately, a passage like that fits in exactly with Heidegger's sense that that Thomas has flattened out even further Aristotle's understanding of wonder and has lost sight of it altogether. Now, Jude and others, Thomists might want to push back and say, but we can find it in other places, or we can find it in the sermons, or we can find it in the hymns. But insofar as Thomas is commenting on Aristotle, right here, Heidegger says, look what's happened to wonder. Heidegger wants to say something like, philosophy begins and ends in wonder. And Thomas is saying it begins in wonder, but once we know the causes, wonder ceases. And so that is another step toward the systematic metaphysical positions of Hegel and Spinoza and the metaphysics of let's know everything, or let's accumulate knowledge and establish this great system of metaphysical thinking. So it's a step along that way.
I tried, so I just hope.
No. I still am sympathetic to what you're saying.
But yeah, that's what my old teacher Robert Jensen used to say, that Aquinas makes Aristotle say things that he never said. And I think but another thing about Aquinas is we have to remember that he was up against the Islamic tradition during that social time, and with Islamic philosophers, which he took a lot of his work from them. And so the context of the times, I think, is also important about where Aquinas was during that time and what he was facing, what questions he had to answer, I guess the world that he was thrown into.
Yeah, Jude, would you like to give voice to something of a defense of?
Maybe I'll say a few words because I don't want Aquinas to steal the thunder on a Heidegger seminar. But yeah, I'm quite familiar with some of the scholastic works, especially by the time when they were written in the 1800s, and they do come across as really quite dry. For example, I still do read this person called Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, who was a very well-known Thomist at the Angelicum, and the impression you get when you look at his philosophical works is that they are a bit like computer programming code, as it were. So they're not really the kind of exciting poetic literature that Heidegger wants to point us towards. So I think I'm very sympathetic to some of Heidegger's criticisms of the scholastic tradition. When it comes to Aquinas, maybe I'll have a look at the text that Richard is talking about again to see whether he qualifies that, or maybe he was just maybe it's more of his earlier works. Because if my impression of his later commentaries on the Liber de Causis, for example, especially the preface, you get a sense that even after you've gotten, if you unpacked metaphysically the first causes, there is this lingering sense of being amazed and even of being blinded by that which you could not fully grasp, you know. And of course, Aquinas at the end, as the anecdote says, he sort of had a mystical experience, and he said whatever he written was like straw. I suppose maybe that was a kind of you could say that was his own repudiation of his commentary on Aristotle. Maybe that's going too far, but yeah. So those are my immediate thoughts. But I especially liked Richard's discussion of the two senses of philosophy, because Aquinas aside, I like the difference that Richard's trying to articulate. The earlier kind of philosophy as a kind of almost as if you were a lover responding to somebody's courting, as it were, being courting you, whereas the later kind of philosophy is really that kind of striving. Sounds like what we do nowadays in academia. I have to sit down and get words typed out, and sometimes it becomes a chore. Unless, of course, I get into it and get excited about it. But it starts off, as it were, by some kind of hardworking Pelagian effort. Whereas I think Heidegger was trying to get at something, the primordial experience was maybe not like the one I experienced when I went to Japan. You go into a garden and you suddenly fall in love with the place, and you just bathe in its beauty, you know.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So and the other, I used to think about this metaphor of a child who is autistic going to the playground. Imagine a child who's autistic and can't really pick up cues to understand how people relate to him or her, and has difficulty relating people. So the child is in the playground trying to coordinate like his or her actions in order to participate in a game, maybe the slides or the merry-go-round, and it's all very hardworking. That's very much like the philosophy that Heidegger's complaining about. Whereas prior to that mental disorder, as it were, prior to that mental disorder, I hope I'm not offending anybody in case any of us had an autistic childhood, but prior to that mental disorder, a healthier child would be able to read social cues and then quickly form relationships and play with others. Whereas now if philosophy is a kind of play, and Aristotle and Aquinas talks about philosophy as a kind of play, it's our play, merely playing with ideas, or but not really forming a relationship with other players. I probably have to find a better way to talk about it, but it's almost as if we are doing our own thing amongst others. When we are doing philosophy, we are doing our own thing. It's coming from us totally, even when nature is reaching out to us, but it's not getting through to us, as it were. Okay, maybe I said too much. Perhaps better to hear others.
I love what you said, Jude, and to me, I think that this is the contribution of phenomenology. Not that it has overcome metaphysics, but that it's a different style of philosophizing where we are able to express the experience of the relation with being more freely, more openly, more richly. So to me, it's a style of thinking that is important and that was introduced in what we call this age of phenomenology, or phenomenological thinking, or phenomenological writing, or phenomenological philosophy, whatever you want to call it. But it has nothing to do with overcoming metaphysics, as some understand it. It has to do perhaps with how one does metaphysics now, no longer in that style of scholasticism. It seems not possible to do it in that style any longer after Heidegger. It must be transformed. It must be transfigured into a different way of expressing ourselves philosophically. And in that sense, we could say, we could determine or discern a difference between phenomenological thinking or writing and traditional scholastic philosophical writing, or analytic philosophy, right? I mean, we certainly can make or discern a difference between those ways of thinking, but it's not about overcoming metaphysics. That is an assumption that we've talked about before that is not sound.
Well, but maybe I don't know. I always remember that in many passages of many works of Heidegger, he insists in this idea, this simple idea that the questioner is never outside of the question. So maybe the difference between, or maybe he saw the difference between this primordial way of philosophizing in relation to the metaphysical tradition that started with Plato and Aristotle. This decisive change, maybe in the beginning, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, they didn't detach themselves from the questioning. They were not a neutral, or at least they were in I don't want to use the subject-object language because it was not already present, but I guess that he's trying to say that philosophy, it is not possible that philosophy could continue in this theoretical approach in which the philosopher or the thinker is a neutral one, that he doesn't get affected, deeply affected, and that is why he always privilege this attunements and moods and dispositions, because he knows that philosophizing cannot be done in this theoretical approach that science is the best example that we can know. Science can de-world any thing or object and can be neutrally focused on that object or on that domain of research. And maybe this is I don't know, but maybe this and we know that existential structures that he developed in Being and Time, they clearly show us that the being of human being is always a being in the world, and it cannot be separated from the big questions. I don't know if I was clear, but maybe this non-separation from the questioner and the question itself is at the root of this more original way of related myself to being. I don't know, Richard, if you want to say
Alberto,
something.
that's well said, Alberto. I agree completely with you. We're involved. We have something at stake. And that's something that traditional rationalistic metaphysics had overlooked for all of its virtues. I mean, there are virtues to those traditions of the rational canon. I mean, after all, we have to appreciate the clarity and the preciseness of that tradition of thinking, but it overlooks what you're saying, Alberto. You're right that we're involved. We're involved. We have something at stake, and I think that that's true still, even in Plato, to some extent, right? And it's true in Augustine more than it is in Thomas, I think, right? In the philosophical writing, at least, it's clearer in Augustine than it is in Thomas. Although, again, I mean, if we read some of Thomas's sermons, or if we read some of the songs or hymns, we might have a different picture. But insofar as Walter's volumes of the Summa sitting up on his library shelf, we're not going to find it there. We're not going to find it there, really.
But they look good.
Yes. Very impressive, Walter. I mean,
Exactly. Well, Sharon, I'm sorry, I don't mean to, but I just, this brings up, this is so on to what I'm kind of doing right now. But Jude's comment about going to Japan reminded me of an experience I think relates to this very much, and I'd like your thoughts on it, Richard, because it comes from a different tradition. Because we're talking about the Greeks as the founders of thinking and philosophy and all that, but there is a whole other part of the world which is like in China and Japan and all that. And I had an experience many years ago when I was on business and in China, in the Beijing area, and my host and I was completely in a metaphysical American business, do the deal, you know, everything you can imagine. There was nothing philosophical in my existence at that time that would relate to this. And my host said, would you like to go into the temple of Confucius, the Confucian temple? And I'm always up for take me, you know. So I said, let's go. And he said, well, we got in and he said, here's what you do. And they just had a long row of tablets that had Confucius's sayings. And he said, what you do, he said, it's kind of like you don't think, you just walk slowly through the aisle and observe and read the sayings and just very slowly do that. And I did. I very slowly, and you had to remove all your thinking, everything you had, And it was an experience very much like that. It was experiencing something in the world speaking to you. It was a very meditative type thing, very not metaphysical type of thing. So what, the Chinese have, and the Orientals have a great tradition of this type of thinking too, don't they? And where did Heidegger stand with that?
Well, Alfred could chime in too, but I would simply say, I remember Gadamer saying to me, because this question had come up when Gadamer was lecturing, and he said that Heidegger was very reluctant. Now, we know that he had Japanese followers. We know that he had interest in Chinese thinking, and that there are these similarities, there are these important parallels. But Gadamer said to me once that Heidegger was very reluctant to say too much because he didn't know the language. He didn't know Japanese, he didn't know Chinese, he couldn't read the original texts. And so he was very, very hesitant to make any kinds of comparisons, even though he certainly does suggest some in his work. But my sense, at least, Walter, is that he was fully aware of the connection, of the possibilities, but that he was very hesitant to say very much about it. In fact, in one of my books, I had published a talk that Sujimori, the Japanese scholar from Kyoto, where Jude was, gave an address to honor Heidegger at his 80th birthday. And Heidegger's response was, I find what you're saying to be very interesting, but I can't say much about it. I don't really have the wherewithal to comment extensively on what you're saying or the connections between what I'm doing and Zen Buddhism in particular. So I don't know, Alfred, what might you want to add there?
I think Heidegger is always very careful not to talk about philosophers publicly that he can't read in the original language. Is also the reason why he didn't do anything on Kierkegaard, for example. He did it in Danish. And he's very extremely careful, contrary to a lot of other people, in the discussion with these Eastern traditions of thinking, because you have the language problem.
Yeah.
You can very easily translate Eastern thinking and back into our metaphysical kind of thinking and lose exactly what is different. I think that's why Heidegger, of course, he met with several people. He met Suzuki, he met other Japanese professors. He met also some Chinese people, some people from India, and they had always interesting discussion. I think an example is this conversation with the Japanese professor on the way to language, where they talk about how you can translate certain words into Japanese. And one example is then the translation for language, which according to the Japanese professor would amount to something like cherry blossom. Well, if you think of language as cherry blossom, you already see that's very different from the way we try to understand language. I think you could, if you use the metaphor of the houses of being that he uses in lateral humanism, then we live in different houses of being. So if you really want to translate, basically you have to move into the other house for a longer period and get a real understanding and feel for the differences. I think it's already within Europe. I've been living in different countries in Europe, but if you stay there for 6, 7 years, begin to get some idea of the differences between Dutch people, German people, French people, Spanish people, and also the similarities, the shared tradition of philosophy, for example, and Christianity. I think in Heidegger, the Roman Catholic faith belongs to his facticity. So it's never going to go away. He's, of course, rethinking it and taking different stances on it. But he would always, if he went into a church, he would always kneel, for example. So and for him, Byron, the Benedictine abbey, where he went to a lot in his early years, for him that was a living kind of Christianity. These monks were dedicating their life to the service of God for the common good, praying for all of us. And that's the kind of, it's always about the living thing for Heidegger. It's the same with thinking. When he's giving a lecture or doing a lecture course, he tries to get his students involved, awake to this attunement of boredom, so that they can learn to think from this experience. He tries to take his audience on a path of thinking so they can make an experience of thinking. You cannot teach people how to think, but you can learn how to think. That's an interesting difference, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And even in his time, who was it? Romano Guardini. Guardini, who was an Orthodox Roman Catholic, nonetheless took from Heidegger just that lesson that Alfred is mentioning, that it's not enough to simply present the doctrines and the dogmas, but one must somehow make it alive, right? Make it live, make it experiential. There has to be what Alberto said, that we're involved and that there's something at stake for us and something that we have to bring alive for ourselves. So even though Guardini remained very much an Orthodox Roman Catholic, he found great inspiration in Heidegger's thinking and work and lecturing.
Guardini and Heidegger already met in 1915.
Yeah.
With Richard, and they would go on weekly walks together.
Yeah.
In the 50s, Guardini also spoke at some of these conferences that were organized in Munich, where Heidegger also gave some of his most famous lectures.
Yeah. And Alfred, you had mentioned that in this period that he gave this lecture that we're talking about, he met with Gabriel Marcel, and Marcel's impression of Heidegger after that had changed because, Marcel was very, very concerned about the early Heidegger. He thought that the early Heidegger, the Heidegger of being in time, was quite the nihilist, and we've talked about that before. There are fundamental and significant difference between the Heidegger of being in time and the later Heidegger. But Marcel was very turned off by being in time. He just thought it was, part and parcel of the existentialist movement, Sartre and Camus, and this basic nihilism. But when he heard Heidegger speak here in the 50s, when he talked with him in the 50s, he had an entirely different impression of Heidegger. And Marcel says, no, Martin Heidegger too was concerned with being as the holy, the sacred. He was very impressed, and he said that there is, he told Ricoeur, as a matter of fact, he told Ricoeur that I have discovered a great connection between Heidegger's thinking now and my own. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, when you think about it, that's literally what the Gospels are, is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John experiencing the risen Christ for themselves and then writing accounts of it. So, there's nothing more important than us experiencing that ourselves in the liturgy or in the vigil. I think he captures the core of, not just have a dogmatic thing. Just like today, we could let this book just sit on a shelf, or here today, we're bringing it live in dialogue to further peace among people from many different countries. And boy, doesn't that say a lot?
Right.
And I think Heidegger is not so negative about Aquinas as people think as well. He spent quite a lot of time in his lecture courses on Aquinas as well. And he's not somebody to blame a thinker for doing the work he does. It's also to the time you're doing it.
Maybe I can surface for discussion the passage that Alfred showed on his slide as well. I think it was slide 8. Heidegger said that there was a Greek way of wondering, but we also inherited the Greek way of asking the question about that wonder or that question about being. And if I'm not mistaken, he meant that to mean that the Greek way of asking the question about being was a problematic way of asking, because it asks about what that was all about, what things are. And the question about what things are sort of obscured the isness of things. I don't know if that's correct. And maybe for me, the question is if we want to not ask the question what things are, how are we going to ask what's the other way of asking the question so that we don't get trapped in that kind of that kind of questioning that obscures the core matter of being. And I don't have an answer to that, but and I'm not an expert on Zen Buddhism either, so maybe I shouldn't say too much. But it did occur to me that in some strands of Zen Buddhism, it's interesting it's in Buddhism, because you think of Buddhism, especially in the Nepalese or the Tibetan version, it's all very scholastic. But in Zen Buddhism, there's this whole notion of somehow avoiding that logical, rational thinking, and they use things like koans, which are puzzles, almost like mystical phrases that sort of confound and frustrate your logical thinking. Maybe so that you would give that up and sort of avert to a different way of engaging what you're experiencing. I don't know, but certainly something that I'm now quite interested to look at. I used to look at Zen Buddhism a bit, but sort of left it aside. But now this whole thing is quite interesting to me, especially in relation to Heidegger's complaint about the Greek way of asking the question of being, that obsession with what things are and trying to give an account of what things are in terms, say, in Aristotle's case, in terms of substance, the accidents and whatnot, all these metaphysical concepts.
Yeah, no, that's very important. I think, Jude, that he is asking us, or Heidegger is asking us to rethink how we address being, right? How we ask that question. And he does say that it's Aristotle in particular who becomes preoccupied with this question of what something is, which in turn becomes this tradition of seeking a definition of something. And so we could say that for Aristotle, he's still engaged with things in seeking the essence or the substance of something, but that then in later years, that all falls away, and now we become only preoccupied with the definition of something or the concept of something. And then in the modern age, in the age of subjectivism, we're only concerned with how the mind forms those concepts and definitions. We're not even engaged with things at all. We're only engaged with the formation of meaning or the formation of concepts or the formation of definitions and how the mind goes about doing that. And certainly, to me, this is at the core of Husserl's project in some sense. But it's certainly the case in analytic philosophy or in analytic philosophy of mind. which is as far removed from Aristotle, I think, as it is from Heraclitus and Anaximander and Parmenides.
Yes. Thank you for that, Richard.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you. Good. That's very, very important to keep thinking about that.
Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, we can wrap it up. And
Yeah, to me, it happens to be Saturday afternoon, so I can't think of a better way to spend a Saturday afternoon than this. So, thanks to all of you.
Well, just to let you know, next week we have a conference on Heidegger in the nearness of the holy and the divine. So it's in some ways with our discussion today. If you're interested, let me know, and I can send you the links for the Zoom and the Google Drive. And as usual, we'll keep doing our little program of Heidegger webinars and other things such as roundtables like this one. So thank everybody for being there as usual. Hope to see you again. Some of you I will be seeing next week anyway. So have a nice Sunday and stay healthy and take care. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all.
Thank you very
Goodbye
much.
now.
Bye.